right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Truth Noir. I have a guest with me today who is going to talk about a topic that I've been very interested in broaching for quite some time. He is a musician, independent biblical scholar, and a person who has connected the dots in some old prophecies that apparently will have some effect pretty soon on humanity at large. So I wanted to bring him on and talk to him about it. I want to introduce him to you right now. Steve Mashni, thank you very much.
It's great to be here.
I know, among other things, being a musician and scholar, you are also an author of these small, very readable booklets about various biblical prophecies and, I don't know, could you call it end of days or second coming scenarios?
Yeah, it's about biblical prophecies about the end of the world and stuff.
Okay. So what we're going to do is actually a two-part episode. Tonight we're going to talk about prophecies that were fulfilled, which led up to the birth of Jesus. It turns out his first coming had been prophesied, I think, at the latest in the Old Testament, about 500 years before the fact.
About 400. Yes.
About 400. And then our next episode, we're going to look at prophecies also from the Bible, some from the same books of the Bible, that are also prophesying things that we see happening right now, and those we're being told deal with the second coming of Christ and what will bring about some pretty crazy changes in the world. And if the prophecies that led up to the original coming are any indicator, this stuff will probably happen very soon. And I know it's been said a lot, but I figured the hell with it. Let's bring it up again. So, Hussein, we're glad to have you on the show.
Good to be here.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you come to start studying these aspects of the Bible?
Well, first of all, thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak about my book.
Sure.
And I'm from the Middle East. My father is Palestinian, and so I've always felt a connection with stuff that's going on over there. And I became a Christian when I was 15 years old, and I've always been interested in in biblical prophecies and stuff. And it was a big thing that happened in the 70s. There's a big book called The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey, and that became a really big movie in 70, probably before you were born. But
A little bit, not by much.
And so anyway, ever since then, I've been interested. But my interest has waned and come back, But then as I've been watching stuff happening, especially with Russia and Iran, and, today Putin said that, he threatened the possibility of using nukes on ISIS. Well, you look in the book of Ezekiel in the Bible, it talks about stuff like that.
Sure.
And so, for me, it's always been interesting. And I was a journalist. I was a reporter for several years at a newspaper. And so I got the journalism and the Bible. And then sometimes I read the newspaper and I say, "Whoa, that's just like what it says in the Bible," So.
Right. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And as I say a lot on the show, it's kind of hard to believe in coincidences after a while when these things keep happening, and everyone's like, "Oh, who'd have thought?" And it turns out that whether it's government activity or biblical history, that yes, these things do keep happening, and we would probably do well to actually start paying attention to these things. And so help us out here, because a lot of us, myself included, are not familiar with certain of the tiny details of the Bible, and that's where, in reading your book, I've come to find that that's where some of the most interesting stuff is that is often overlooked. So let's go ahead and jump right in and tell us some of the specific things that happened in the Old Testament that have prophesied
fulfilled.
the birth of Jesus.
Yeah, first I always like to start with, there's a prophecy, there's a prophet in the Old Testament named Isaiah, and he's called like the Prince of the Prophets. He's like the biggest book of prophets in the Old Testament is Isaiah. Then there's Jeremiah, Daniel, but he's the biggest is Isaiah, and very important, very articulate writer and speaker and prophet. And there's an interesting prophecy in Isaiah 46, verse 10. This is where God says, I will show you the end from the beginning. He said, and he's saying, I'm going to show you what's going to happen to where when it happens, you're going to know that it was me that was speaking. Right. So God, he says in Isaiah that that is something that he uses in the Bible in order to prove that it is the Word of God, that it is from him, that it's outside of time. And if you look specifically, like with the subject of all of prophecy, deal with two things, namely the first coming of Jesus 2,000 years ago and the second coming of the Messiah, in the future, and I believe in the very near future.
Sure.
And so if we look at the Bible, you find out that about, just the very blatant prophecies, some of them written 1,000 years before Jesus was born, that could not have been just some conjecture, somebody's imagination. They're just amazing clarity in these prophecies. And I could start with this is the very first prophecy in all of the Bible.
Okay.
About the coming of the Messiah. This is in the Torah. It was written by Moses, and it was right after, most people are familiar with the story of Adam and Eve. God told them, don't eat of the tree, and then Eve went and ate of it, and then Adam ate of it, and then they sinned. And then God came and he said to Adam, where are you? And Adam hid behind the trees, and then God says, where are you? He says, well, I was ashamed because I was naked, and God said, who told you that you were naked? Because before they didn't know, but somebody had spoken to them, and he said, who told you? And then he says, tells them what happens. And there's an interesting verse. It's in chapter 3, verse 15 of the book of Genesis that was written by Moses. This is the first book of the Torah. It's called Genesis. And there God says to Eve, he says to Adam, first of all, he says to the devil, the devil was a snake. He says to the devil, this is what's interesting, chapter 3, verse 15, he says, I will put enmity between your seed, and the woman's seed.
Interesting.
Now, the seed comes from the man. It doesn't come from the woman. But he says, and the woman's seed. I'm going to put enmity between your seed and the woman's seed. He will crush your head. You will bruise his heel. This is the first prophecy. And what do we have in this prophecy? You just look, first of all, that there's somebody, because it says he. So it's talking about a person who's going to come, and he's going to be born of the woman, not of the man.
Okay.
There's only one person in history, in the Bible, that was born of woman, not of man, and that was Jesus, who was born of Mary, the virgin. And he did not have the seed of man, the fallen seed of man from Adam.
Right.
And so the seed of the woman was going to crush the devil's head, but it says that the devil was going to hurt his heel. So the devil was going to hurt him.
Yeah.
Because it says
there would still be some kind of injury involved.
Yeah. And so this is the first prophecy. This was written 1,500 years before Jesus was born, talking about someone who would be of the seed of the woman and who would come and crush the devil and would be injured in the process. Okay? And so that's the first prophecy in the book, all of the Bible, about the coming of the Messiah. And then, now there's many others. I'm not going to go over all of them, of course.
Sure.
But
well, yeah, because it wouldn't fit in an hour. You said that there are over, in this book that you've written, that there are over 350.
300 prophecies about the first coming.
Right, and then even more so regarding the
About
second coming.
500 about the second coming that we know. There's other symbols and types as well,
Sure.
that, For instance, like a type is like when Abraham presented his son. He went up to Mount Moriah and he presented his son. This is the next big prophecy. God said to Abraham, he says, go and sacrifice your son on Mount Moriah. The interesting thing about that is, Abraham went, he took his son, Isaac, who was born miraculously because, Abraham was 100 years old, Sarah was 90 years old, so it was a miraculous conception that.
Sure.
And he took Isaac and he went up to the hill to present, and you know the story, that he was going to kill his son, and then the angel says, don't.
Yeah, stayed his hand.
Yeah, he stayed his hands. And then he sent a ram, and the ram was killed in the place of the son. This picture, there's an interesting thing that Abraham says when this incident is over. After his son was saved, he sacrificed the ram. Abraham says something very interesting. He says he called the mountain, he called it Jehovah Jireh.
Okay.
And what that means is God will provide the lamb. And that was on Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah is in Jerusalem. It is today the site of the Dome of the Rock, where the Muslims say that Abraham offered Ishmael. Okay, and the Jews believe that, and the Christians believe that this is where Abraham presented Isaac.
So yeah, definitely some hotly contested real estate these days.
It is the most hot. Like I lived there for several years. You move a rock over there, you could start a war. I mean, it's so contentious. But the interesting thing is, Abraham said, "On this mountain it shall be seen." Well, what else happened on that mountain? That's where Jesus was crucified. He was crucified on that exact same mountain. And so that was like a type of the Father offering the Son.
Sure.
And so that was like you see, the prophecy sometimes is very clear, this is going to happen, but sometimes it's a type that we can look at and see, this is what's going to happen in the future. And so Abraham offering his son was a picture of what God was going to do. And Abraham even said it, on this mountain it shall be seen. So that's the second really big prophetic incident in the book of Genesis. There's another prophecy, and it may not mean a lot to a lot of people who don't know very much about the Bible, but I'll go ahead and tell it anyway.
Okay.
You know that Abraham had a son named Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob. Jacob's name was changed to Israel. He wrestled with the angel, and the angel changed his name to Israel, and that's why we have Israel today, is from his name, Jacob. And Jacob had 12 sons. Joseph, Benjamin, Issachar, Naphtali. He had 12 sons altogether. But when Jacob was really old, he prophesied over his sons right before he died. And he says, this is what's going to happen with you, this is what's going to happen with you, and this is what's going to happen with you. And he says something interesting to one of his sons whose name is Judah. Judah, Jacob says to him that the law that the Shiloh, because at that time that's what they called the Messiah, was Shiloh. That Shiloh was going to come from the tribe of Judah. So of all the sons of Jacob, Shiloh, the Messiah, was going to come from the tribe of Judah. Okay, and that's significant if you're a biblical scholar. For a lot of people, it doesn't mean much.
Sure, yeah, well, I know a lot of these things are so easy to overlook, the meaning of, and so I'm glad we have you here to kind of help decipher some of this stuff, because I know there's so much of it.
There is another person, I want to say there's another person who came from the tribe of Judah who's very important in the Bible, and who is also an ancestor of Jesus. And Jesus, the Messiah, is called the Son of David. This is King David. King David was from the tribe of Judah, because the tribe of Judah became the kingly tribe. The kings all came from the tribe of Judah. So they were the kings of Israel, were all from the tribe of Judah. And Jesus would come as the king as well. Descended, they called him the Son of David. So there's that connection to another important biblical figure that people may recognize his name, King David.
Sure.
So that that's another very important prophecy. A little bit, like I said, if you don't know very much about the Bible, that may be a little bit just a piece of information that is important to have.
Well, yeah, definitely yet another clue that
And then, if you want, there's another prophecy. It's now this one was written about 700 years before Jesus was born. The prophet's name is Micah, and he was about 700 years. It was about the same time as Isaiah. About 700 years before Jesus was born, he wrote, and his prophecy is phenomenal. It is just an amazing prophecy because he specifies the city where Jesus would be born.
Okay.
I'll go ahead.
Yeah, please do.
I could just read it to you from the Bible because, it's a very. Let me make sure. I'm getting old here. My glasses. But I'd like to actually read it to you just so that you see that this is. Okay, Micah. It's Micah chapter 5. Verse 2, and there's some amazing things about this prophecy.
And so now for reference, this is the last book of the Old Testament. Is that correct?
No, this is the last book of the Old Testament, or in the Christian Bible, it's Malachi.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure exactly how the Jews, Jews order them, but in the Christian Old Testament, the last book of the Old Testament is Malachi. Micah is a few books back.
Okay.
But he was in the time of Isaiah, which is about 700 years before Jesus was born. And this is what he says. He says in chapter 5, verse 2, it says, "But you, O Bethlehem Ephratah, though you are little among the thousands of Judah, out of you will come one unto me who shall be the ruler of Israel." And this prophecy was known. I don't know if you remember the story of the wise men, because every Christmas they talk about the wise men who came with the gifts.
Right, yeah.
And the wise men came to Israel, and they were looking for Jesus, because they saw the star, and they said, they came to Herod first, and they said, "Where is the king who's supposed to be born? Because we saw his star." And the king Herod, he was scared, and so what he did is he called the priests, the Jewish priests, and he said to them, "What does your book say? Where's the Messiah going to be born?" And the priests said, "The Bible says it's going to be in Bethlehem." So they knew that this was going to be in Bethlehem, that he was going to be born there. And it's also very specific because there was 2 Bethlehems at that time, but this one is very specific. This is Bethlehem Ephratah, which is the Bethlehem that's right next to Jerusalem. And to this day, it's a Palestinian city right now, but to this day, it is located right there, and that's where the Church of the Nativity, where Jesus was born, is. So.
Right. I wasn't aware that there were 2 Bethlehems. Where is the other one?
The other one is somewhere north in Israel. I think it was in the tribe of Naphtali or something. This is in the northern part of Israel. So. Okay. But this is very specific. It's that one, and that is the one where Jesus was born, in Bethlehem Ephratah. It was mentioned in Matthew chapter 2. It says where he was born. Okay, so this is a very big prophecy. I mean, of all the cities in the world where the king...
Right, even the ancient world, which was not quite as big of a place, yes, but still.
There was thousands of cities, and yet it's predicted exactly in this tiny little village. It was a tiny village at the time. But this is also, for those who know the Bible, this is also the city where King David lived and where he was born.
Oh, okay.
So there is biblical significance to Bethlehem, even though it was a small city. But its significance is primarily that it was so close to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is like the holy city. So yeah. That's one prophecy. Another prophecy, which I already alluded to it, but I'll go ahead and say it again. This is in the prophet Isaiah. The prophet, again, prince of the prophets. Isaiah chapter 7, and this one is on all the Christmas cards. And it's a very, very important prophecy. It's in chapter 7. It says in chapter 7, verse 14, it says, "Therefore the Lord will give you a sign." Okay, so Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, was talking to the king of Israel. And he told him, God's going to give you a sign. He says, "The Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin shall conceive." the virgin is going to conceive and bear a son, and they will call his name Emmanuel, which means, it comes from the Hebrew, Emmanuel means God with us. It's talking about God being with us, God incarnating, becoming one of us.
Sure.
And so, this is, phenomenal prophecy about it is a virgin that's going to bring forth. We have from the Genesis where it says it's going to be the seed of the woman. But here it specifies, there's no, the man isn't involved at all, that this is going to be a virgin who's going to bring forth the Son of God.
Okay.
So this is in Isaiah 7, verse 14. And then, if we go also, would you like me just to continue like this? Or?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating to me.
In Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 15, there is another very interesting prophecy about these prophecies have to do with the birth of Jesus.
Okay.
It gets really fascinating when we get to the death. That it's absolutely amazing, the things regarding his death. But this one, 31 verse, what did I say? 15?
I believe so.
Yeah, 31:15 in Jeremiah. This was written also about 700 years before Jesus was born. It says, "A voice is heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping, Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted, for her children were no more." In the book of Matthew, it describes what this prophecy is referring to. And I think you may remember, if you've watched Christmas movies and stuff, that when Jesus was born, the King Herod, after the...
Right, he sent out the goon squad basically to try to wipe him out because he didn't want to lose power.
Another king, yeah, he was
Right.
afraid. And so he sent his soldiers, and they killed all the babies, all the boys 2 years old and under in Bethlehem. You see,
Right.
and that this was, and it says in the book of Matthew, when it talks about that incident, it says this is fulfilling what the prophet Jeremiah said, that Rachel is weeping. Rachel, by the way, is one of the wives of Jacob, and Jacob had 4 wives. They had polygamy back then.
Right.
And Rachel was the one that he loved the most. And her tomb to this day is right there on the border between Bethlehem and Jerusalem.
Oh, really?
To this day, and it's one of the most controversial spots in the Middle East, because it's right on the border between the Israeli and Palestinian territory. I've been there many times, and
Right.
very controversial place. But anyway, so that's why this is talking about the slaughter of the children happened right when Jesus was born. Another thing, in Hosea 11:1, it says, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." And what happened, if you remember the story, when Herod tried to kill Jesus, that an angel came to Joseph and told him, "Go to Egypt, take the baby because Herod's going to try to kill him." So he fled to Egypt. And then it says at that point in the book of Matthew, it says, this is fulfilling the prophecy of Hosea that out of Egypt I called my son. Because a few years later, the angel appeared and said to Joseph, "Now bring the kid back because
Right.
Herod is dead." So that's another prophecy here. Then we're going to skip all the way down to the coming, that when Jesus actually grew up, about when Jesus grew up. But before it talks about Jesus, it talks quite a bit, several places in the Bible where it in the book of Isaiah and in the book of Malachi, where it talks about a forerunner, somebody who's going to come before Jesus. That was John the Baptist, if you know from the Bible. And it predicts his coming several times, a voice crying in the wilderness. And I'm not going to focus too much on that, just because I really want to make sure that we have enough time to get to the death, because that's where it becomes so fascinating. And there's, one thing about the death of Jesus is that I told you there was a prophecy by Abraham. Abraham said where he was going to be crucified. He said, "On this mountain it shall be seen." So and Abraham was 2,000 years before Jesus was born.
Right.
And he predicted the place where the Lamb of God would be provided. But there is a prediction, and this is a little bit complicated because you got to really add things to understand it, but it is very clear though. And it's in the prophet Daniel. I'm sure you've heard of prophet Daniel, the one with the lions. And
Right, yeah. I've heard it said as one of the most like contested books of the Bible. It's very abstract.
it's one of the most contested, and yet it's been proven over and over and over again. Because the amazing thing about the book of Daniel is that it predicted things before they happened, and they were fulfilled in, just like a few hundred years after he spoke them. For instance, the rise of the Greek Empire, the rise of the Persian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, and the rise of the Roman Empire. He predicted all of those, and he predicted the order that they would come in. But he had a prediction about Jesus. And because of time limits, I'm not going to be able to tell you, but Gabriel the angel, I'm sure you heard of Gabriel the angel, came to Daniel. And he told him this phenomenal prophecy, and this is like 500 years before Jesus was born. 500 years before Jesus was born. He said, 70 weeks have been given to your people. He said this to Daniel. Now, your people being the Jews, because he was Jewish. He says, 70 weeks have been given to your people to do 6 things. And, to end sin, to end sacrifice, there's several things that they're going to do. But the thing is that Gabriel says to him, he said to him, you will know when the 70 weeks, when we say 70 weeks, let me just explain that. A week, we know there's weeks of 7 days. That's a week. There's also in the Torah, weeks of weeks. For instance, 7 weeks, that's a week of weeks. Then there's weeks of months, 7 months.
Oh, wow, okay.
And there's weeks of years.
Sure.
And this is speaking about weeks of years. So 70 weeks have been given to your people. And that's 490 years. 7 weeks, 7 70-year periods. That's 400. From the time, and Gabriel tells Daniel, he says to him, from the time the order goes forth to rebuild Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was destroyed at this time because of the disobedience, because King Nebuchadnezzar from Babylon, I got to be careful because I know a lot of people don't understand what I'm talking about here.
Right, yeah. Well, Nebuchadnezzar was one of the ancient
Babylonian kings,
yes.
Yeah. And he came and destroyed Jerusalem. There was an order from a Persian king to rebuild Jerusalem. We know exactly when that order went forth. It was May 4th, I believe it was 399 BC. Gabriel says to Daniel, he says, from the time of the order to rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the king will be 69 weeks.
Okay.
69 weeks is 383 years. That was exactly what happened. And, some people say, well, that was written after Jesus came, because it's so exact. I mean, we know exactly. It's fulfilled to the day when Jesus rode into Jerusalem riding on a donkey. To the day, from May 4th, 398 BC until the time was exactly the 69 weeks that Gabriel predicted to Daniel. He told them exactly the day that Jesus was going to ride into Jerusalem, riding on a donkey. And in case you don't know, that he rode on the donkey coming into Jerusalem 5 days before he was crucified. So this was like speaking about the time of the crucifixion. And then Gabriel says to Daniel, he says, then the Messiah, after the 69 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off. And the word there means he will be killed.
Right, yeah, very specific.
And not for himself. It specifically says that, and not for himself. That means he died for somebody else, which we believe he died for us.
Sure.
And so, we got the where. Abraham said it would be there at Mount Moriah. We have Daniel telling us when it was going to happen. Now let me just tell you some of the prophecies around the death, and interrupt me anytime, if I'm talking.
Yeah, sure. I did want to say one thing, because I know I kind of base my show around, like, being skeptical and asking questions.
Sure.
And, the one thing that has lent a lot more credence to me with the Bible, because I am very skeptical, is outside sources, not only selections from the Bible proving later sections of the Bible, but also science.
Right.
Now, in archaeology we have the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, other places in the world like Mohenjo-Daro, which is more from the Hindu tradition, but they've found in the stories where it said there was a city here that was thought to be legendary, and just metaphor for something else. They've found the ruins of these cities, and they have found in these cities the remains of people much in the same positions as
You would expect
Pompeii.
Yes.
Where they saw this horrible
A
thing coming.
sudden death.
Yeah, and there are, the remains of women holding children, or people holding each other, or running away from, these kind of very action sort of scenes. And so, talking about something being destroyed by the wrath of God, it certainly seems that the physical evidence suggests that when they have dug, and it helps me, to view the Bible as more of a historical document than I used to.
Yeah.
And also when your book references the book of Zechariah, as some of the events happening in the second year of Darius.
Right.
And now third-party sources, you can say, Persian sources saying, well, Darius ruled from this point to this point. So this would have been, that now is a much more exact time frame.
Right.
And so that's what has made a lot of this stuff more recently very interesting to me. And so
That's great, yeah.
So yeah, without any further ado, I know we're running a little short on time, and I know you had a big finish plan for us. So
Okay. About how much time do I have, sir?
we have about 10 minutes.
Okay. Let me just there's two major chapters in the Old Testament, to the Jews, it's their Bible, about the death of Jesus.
Okay.
These are some of them. That would be Isaiah chapter 53, Psalm 22.
Okay.
Psalm 22 was written 1,000 years before Jesus was born. It was written by King David, the king of Israel. King David, 1,000 years before Jesus was born, he wrote Psalm 22. Now, when you get to Psalm 22, the first thing you notice, Psalm 22, the first words of it are, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's
also very specific.
That's exactly what Jesus said when he was on the cross.
Right.
And back then, they didn't used to have like Psalm 22, Psalm 23, the way they used to identify each psalm was by saying the first verse of it. And so when Jesus was saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? He was telling the people, go read Psalm 22. Well, let's listen to some of the things that are in Psalm 22. It's absolutely phenomenal. Okay, I'm just going to go over it real fast because there's so much. It says one thing. It says that all the people surround me, and they're insulting. First of all, I mean, there was the words that Jesus said on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? Written 1,000 years before he was born. But then it says what the people around him says, because in Psalm 22 it says that the people look at him and say he believed in God. If God is pleased with them, let him save him. If you read Matthew chapter 27, verse 47, it's exactly what the priests were saying to him. It says, if God is pleased in him, let him save him. Another thing it says in Psalm 22, it says, they gambled for my clothes. 1,000 years before he was born, it says they gambled for my clothes. That's exactly it. Again, read Matthew chapter 27. It says that when they had his robe, they didn't want to tear it. They said, no, let's cast lots for it. That was written 1,000 years before it happened. Another thing it says, my tongue cleaves to the roof of my mouth because he was so thirsty. And at the end, before he died, he said, I thirst. Then it says, all my bones are out of joint. David says that in Psalm 20, he says, all my bones are out of joint. Well, when they crucified him, what they used to do is take the cross and they would put it in the ground with a thump like that, and all their bones would come out of joint.
Yeah, and so now to clarify, crucifixion, although a common execution at the time of Jesus, probably not so much at the time.
It didn't even exist in the time of David. It was created by the Persians 300 years before 700 years after David wrote this. Crucifixion was created by the Persians. And so, the Persians did it differently. They kind of like impaled somebody,
Okay.
And if you read the book of Esther, it talks about them impaling Haman on a tree.
Okay.
But the Romans perfected it, and they're the ones who did what was done to Jesus and to the thousands of other Jews as well, that
Sure.
they did that. But then there's this prophecy. This is unbelievable. This is phenomenal prophecy. Psalm 22. It says, they pierced my hands and my feet. They pierced my hands and my feet. It says that 1,000 years before Jesus was born. David foreseeing. If you want to learn about the crucifixion, you'll learn much more by reading Psalm 22 than you will by reading the New Testament.
Oh,
because
wow.
it describes it so perfectly, of the people mocking him and everything. But when it says they pierced my hands and my feet, phenomenal prophecy. Then, go to Isaiah chapter 53. Phenomenal prophecies there. And it says about Jesus, it says, first of all, that he would be numbered with the transgressors. And remember, he was crucified between two thieves.
Two thieves, yes.
Yeah, but he says, but he will be buried with the rich. And remember, there's a rich man that took him and buried him in his grave.
Right.
And then it also predicts that it says he was hated, he was despised, he did not defend himself. And it says that the people would be amazed that he would not defend himself. Like a lamb led to the slaughter, he would not speak. It talks about his back being beaten. And then it says, and by his stripes we are healed. That he would be striped. And then they beat him with...
Right, the lashing of the whip.
Right. And this is just something I heard. I'm not 100% sure if it's right, but this is something I've heard, is that with the Jews, they were only allowed 39 stripes. When you beat somebody, you were only allowed to beat them with 39 stripes, which is 40 minus 1.
Okay.
And I've heard, now this could be wrong, okay, but I've heard this, that there are 39 kinds of diseases. All of the diseases that are in the world fall into 39 categories. And
Interesting.
You can look it up. I'm not sure. That could be wrong. But if that's the case, because it says, by his stripes we are healed. That's what the scripture in Isaiah 53, written 700 years before Jesus was born.
Right.
And the very last prophecy, I'm just going to say this.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is a phenomenal prophecy, unbelievable. The main prophets that talk about the coming of Jesus are Isaiah and Zechariah. Zechariah speaks about both the first coming and the second coming. And next week we'll talk about the second coming.
For sure.
And Putin plays big in the second coming. So does Adele's new album. But I'm just kidding.
You got me there for a second.
I had to get that one in. But there's this prophecy. It's amazing. In Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10, it says that God speaking says, give me my price if you think it's meat. And it says, and then God speaking says, they weighed out for me 30 pieces of silver. If you remember, that's what happened to Judas. He went and he sold Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. It says, they weighed out for me 30 pieces of silver. But that's not, the verse says that, but then it says, and then he said to me, cast it to the potter in the Lord's house. Take this 30 pieces of silver, cast it to the potter in the Lord's house. Well, the amazing thing is what happened to those 30 pieces of silver after Judas took it. It says that after he got the money and he saw that Jesus was condemned, he regretted it. So he went back to the temple and he says, here, take your money back. And they said, we don't want it. It's your money. And so it says specifically, he threw it in the temple, in the house of God. But what did the priest say? They says, we can't keep this here because this is the price of blood.
Yeah, this is blood money.
Yeah. So they took it and they bought a potter's field with it. In those two verses in Zechariah, written 500 years before Jesus was born, was three major prophecies. First, the 30 pieces of silver. Secondly, that he would throw it into the temple. And third, that they would take that money and buy a potter's field with it. And all of them were fulfilled.
Yeah, again, and very specific things
Very
also.
specific, yeah. So, when you see how specific, I'm going to tell you one prophecy. This is a little bit I'm going to study it to get it perfect for you, but what I'm telling you is correct. There is a king of Israel who was a very evil man back in the time of the prophet Ezekiel. And he was very evil. And the prophet Jeremiah said to him, he said, you will be taken to Babylon as a slave. But the prophet Ezekiel came to him, another prophet, they were contemporaries, and said to him, you will never see Babylon. So one of them said, you're going to be taken to Babylon as a slave. But the other one comes to him and says, you will never see Babylon. But you know what happened is the king of Babylon came and took him. But what did he do to him? He took his eyes out.
Oh, my goodness.
Took him to Babylon. He did not see Babylon, but he was taken to Babylon. Right. And that shows you how specific
both of
the
them
prophecies, both of them were fulfilled.
Even
people
though they
were
were
laughing.
Contrary.
Yeah, and people were laughing, saying, oh, look, the prophets are contradicting themselves. No, it was fulfilled exactly like the Bible said.
Right.
And if it was that specific, then the stuff that's happening in our day, I believe, that's my book here, Magog, Mahdi, and the Mark of the Beast. You can buy it on Amazon.
Right, yeah. Yeah, so I wanted to just get a close-up on this. This is one of, how many So Concerned booklets have you written so far about these kinds of topics?
I've written about this. I write several books about Islam because of how to share the gospel with Muslims. My family's Muslim, and so
Sure.
I've written several books about Islam, and this one is the only one I've written about prophecy. So it's available on Amazon. It's called Magog Mahdi, which is the Islamic Antichrist, and the Mark of the Beast, which is the chip that, keep watching the news.
Yeah, well, it seems like the world is kind of headed, regardless of whether you take this word for it or not. It seems like there's going to be some really interesting times coming up. That's about all we have time for. If you guys are interested in the pamphlet, booklet, it's available on Amazon.com under the name Steve Mashni.
That's my nickname is Steve. So Steve Mashni.
Magog, Medi, and the Mark of the Beast. If you're interested in getting a hard copy of this actual booklet, we'll show the email address for you in a link that will be right here so you can see it. We'll edit that in afterwards, and I'm sure Steve will be very interested to talk to you. So that's all the time we have for today. Please tune in next week. We're going to take all of the prophecies, the example of all of these things coming true in the past that are confirmed both third-party historically and within the book itself. And from there, we're going to go on to next week, where we're going to talk about prophecies coming true in the recent past and as we speak. That foretell of some other crazy things coming up. So thanks for watching. I want to thank Steve Mashni once again for coming on and talking to me about this topic again, which I've been wanting to get into for quite a while. So we'll see you next week. And in the meantime, wherever you're going, get there safe. Take care.